So for this talk, I have set myself a fairly Herculean task, and that is to analyze all three of Herodotus's major battle narratives as possible descendants of a tradition of oral epideixis, by which I mean performance of knowledge, in this case, historical knowledge, for a specific audience. I'm hoping, though, that the payoff of the talk will be proportional to its scope, potentially hoping to reconcile a number of the debates ranging from whether the histories ought to be read as unitary or separatist compositions, uh, whether they are fundamentally oral or literate, whether were composed in the middle or late 5th century, and crucially, how the histories engage with their historical context. My argument is simple, that Herodotus wrote discrete narratives for specific audiences and then integrated those narratives into the histories, and that we can find direct evidence of this compositional history in the narratives of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. I won't go too far into the argument for Herodotus's participation in a culture of performance and orality. In fact, not only do I go into the mechanics and supporting evidence for this theory in my recently published book, which you guys mentioned, but also Elizabeth Irwin and Ivan Matajasic have given a wonderful talk on that subject for this very Herodotus Helpline, and Scarlett Kingsley also gave another great talk on the pre-Socratic context of the histories. You should totally check those videos out if you haven't seen them, but instead, I'm hoping to give you all a brief example of my analytical methodology as it pertains to the Battle of Plataea, and then follow it with a general survey of what I found looking at the Salamis and Thermopylae narratives through the same lens. And if there's anything else that you'd like me to discuss in greater detail, any theory that you'd like me to elaborate later on, I'm happy to answer questions after the talk by email, or even better, I can refer you to the newly minted book that I just mentioned, The Audiences of Herodotus, which goes deep into all of the text and testimonia, which, for the sake of time, I am mostly just going to skip over today. So, with that in mind, I will jump right in to Herodotus's narrative of Plataea, which many others have noted to be odd. In fact, other recent talk on this very helpline by Georgia Proietti notes many of the same aberrations that I will, so I'll recommend you watch her talk too, and to read her wonderful book as well if you haven't. But if it was indeed the oddities of the Plataea narrative that got me started on this train of thought some 10 years ago, and I ended up concluding that many, if not all, of the unexpected elements of the Plataea narrative can be explained if we understand Herodotus to have originally composed the narrative for an Athenian audience. But it's Sparta's role, or the lack thereof, in the narrative that really stands out. In short, for all that the Battle of Plataea was arguably the most important Spartan victory in the classical period, Herodotus's version of the battle is distinctly dismissive, almost hostile toward the Spartans. No other source gives Sparta so little credit, quite the opposite, in fact. Pindar attributes the victory directly to Sparta. Thucydides names the Spartan general Pausanias as the hero of Plataea. Polybius singles out the Spartans for championing the freedom of the Greeks. Simonides appears to have compared Pausanias to Achilles and placed the Dioscuri beside the Spartan regent at the head of the march. And Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, who both rely heavily on Herodotus as a source, nevertheless exhibit no hint of disfavor toward Sparta. But in Herodotus's telling of the battle, namely from 8133 to 970, Sparta plays little to no positive role and often acts callously and treacherously toward its Greek allies. From start to finish, the narrative repeatedly characterizes the Spartans as fearful and self-interested, especially in their unwillingness to face the enemy. The first thing that happens in the narrative is that the Spartans, despite their constantly emphasized fear of the Persians, Sparta promises to defend Athens against the Persian invasion, which actually seems pretty great at first, but unfortunately, the Spartans immediately abandon Attica to protect their own interests by building a wall across the isthmus. And now, when the Athenians realize what the Spartans are doing, and that moving slower and slower at their own leisure, The Spartans will never reach Attica in time. The Athenians evacuate Athens and send envoys to, quote, cast blame on the Spartans for standing by while the barbarians ravage Attica. But the Spartans won't even acknowledge the Athenian envoys, putting off the embassy repeatedly, day by day, for 10 days, at which point Herodotus himself accuses the Spartans of breaking their word and abandoning Athens to the Persians in order to protect their own interests, defending his conclusion logically and at length. Eventually, the Spartans realize that without Athens to stop the Persian navy, their wall won't keep them safe. So they finally take command of the Greek forces and march north. But once the Spartans arrive, they utterly fail to provide any sort of effective leadership or implement any real strategy, except, of course, for constantly retreating. As soon as the Spartans actually stand face to face with the Persians, they immediately try to get out of fighting them, beginning a whole series of episodes in which Herodotus repeatedly emphasizes the Spartans' fear and their flight in the face of battle. Utterly terrified by the Persians, and recalling Athens' recent success against the Persians at Marathon, the Spartans suggest that the Athenians fight the Persians in their place, and the Spartans can fight, whoever else. But unfortunately for the Spartans, the Persians also consider the Spartans to be the weaker opponent. So Mardonius has the Persians follow the Spartans in their battle formation, at which point the Spartans and Athenians again switch places, which again proves futile because Mardonius just follows the Spartans again. In the end, Mardonius sends a herald to ridicule the Spartans for failing to live up to their heroic reputation, saying, quote, before we even get a chance to fight, you Spartans are leaving your post and running away, hiding behind the Athenians and arraying yourselves against our slaves. These are not the actions of brave men, and it's obviously not. But Sparta isn't done running from the Persians. In fact, the only reason the Spartans do finally end up facing the Persians is because of their own poorly coordinated retreat. Amompharetus, one of the Spartans' elite commanders, stubbornly disobeys Pausanias' command to retreat, quote, refusing to flee the Spartans and to bring shame on Sparta. Refusing to flee the Persians and to bring shame on Sparta. And so, despite their best efforts to avoid fighting the Persians, for which Mardonius ridicules them again, the Spartans are left exposed and defenseless at the mercy of the Persians. And even though they do think the gods end up defeating the Persians, Herodotus attributes their victory much more to a mismatch of armor and the other Persians' decision to not actually fight than to Spartan heroism. It's only in the Aristeia, after the fighting is complete as marked by a catalogue of the dead at the end of 970, only then does Sparta finally receive some credit that would be expected for almost single-handedly overthrowing the greatest military threat that Greece had ever faced. Prior to this epilogue, and with the exception of one brief sentence, 964-1, which I'd be happy to talk about after the talk if anybody's interested. Outside of that, fully 82 chapters of Herodotus' narrative, just short of a tenth of the whole history, has been profoundly and unfalteringly negative toward the Spartans. Sparta's consistently negative portrayal in this narrative has been often attributed to Herodotus' larger project of emphasizing Greek disunity, possibly as a precursor to the conflicts that would arise later in the 5th century. But this explanation ignores Herodotus' portrayal of Athens in the same chapters as not only valiant and steadfast in the face of danger, but also heroic and crucial to Greek success in their willingness to put the safety of Greece before their own self-interest. In fact, the entire narrative seems designed to underscore the same pro-Athenian argument that is made both by the Spartans at the beginning of the narrative and more forcefully by Callias the Tegean, who says, quote, if the Athenians do not stand united with us, but ally themselves with the barbarian, then even a strong wall across the isthmus won't keep the Persian from the Peloponnesus. Listen to them before they change their mind and bring down destruction on all of Greece. In short, Greece needs Athens. Even Herodotus, when Mardonius expresses the same conclusion at the narrative's outset, confirms in his own voice that Greece's fate indeed depends on Athens alone. Fortunately for Greece, though, Athens' loyalty is not for sale. As the Athenians put it, no amount of gold or land, however beautiful or excellent, could persuade us to enslave Greece. In the face of immense pressure, Athens declares that they will fight nonetheless, for as long as we have strength, striving only for freedom. They emphasize their resolution by swearing that as long as the sun holds its course, we will make no agreement with Xerxes. And then Herodotus dramatically and emphatically demonstrates Athens' heroic resolve by having an Athenian named Lucidas urge peace with the Persians, which prompts the Athenians to respond collectively by stoning Lucidas to death on the spot. Nor does the episode stop there, because in a rage, the Athenian women track down and stone Lucadas's whole family, which may seem pretty brutal, but Demosthenes actually recalls this very occurrence favorably in his speech to an Athenian audience, saying, "Who wouldn't admire their virtue?" When the Greek and Persian forces do finally face each other, Athens immediately assumes the de facto leading role. In the first action at Plataea, and in the face of Sparta's conspicuous inaction, the Athens volunteer to help the beleaguered Megarians, and Herodotus presents the readers with perhaps the most dramatic and plainly Homeric battle description in the whole histories. 300 picked Athenians stand bravely against repeated charges of the Persian cavalry, eventually managing to unhorse the Persian cavalry commander Mecistius, but Mecistius's godlike armor cannot be pierced, that is, until one brave but anonymous Athenian finds a weakness, the Persian commander's unprotected eye. Whereupon the Persian commander falls, and the Persians fight fiercely and heroic over the commander's corpse, conceding it to the Athenians only at great cost to themselves. And when news of Mecistius's death reaches the Persian camp, quote, "The whole camp grieves for Mecistius, Mardonius especially, shearing themselves and their horses and their oxen and filling up a boundless wail. The echoing cries filled Boeotia." By contrast, in the final struggle at Plataea, the death of Mardonius, the supreme commander of the Persians, whose defeat marks the Spartans' greatest achievement, Mardonius's death receives only the phrase "when Mardonius died," and the Persians' reaction is to run away as quickly as possible, presumably leaving their commander's corpse to the Greeks. It's clear whose death the narrative values more. Mardonius may have had the command, but Herodotus portrays his lieutenant Mecistius as a far more impressive Persian, and he makes a great effort to highlight his death at the hands of the Athenians. Herodotus immediately underscores this grand Athenian success with a speech competition that thinly veils a list of Athens' proudest accomplishments. The Athenians first list several of their most celebrated mythical feats, including their protection of the Heraclids against Eurystheus, commonly cited in funeral orations. They also cite their intervention in the strife at Thebes to bury the body of Polynices and the Argive heroes, which is the subject of Euripides' suppliant women and also common in funeral orations. They cite their archetypal victory over the Amazons, prominently featured on the Parthenon and the shield of the Athena Parthenos, and also common in funeral orations. They conclude their argument by citing their victory at Marathon, which is another funeral oration favorite, saying, "Wouldn't we be justified in taking up the honor guard for this one deed alone?" And when the Athenians finish their speech, Herodotus has the entire Spartan army rise up with a shout of acclamation, declaring Athens the victor. In fact, the Spartans are so convinced that they later use Athens' success at the Battle of Marathon as their excuse for wanting the Athenians to fight the Persians instead of them. And in fact, the only reason the Athenians didn't face the Persians was because Persia didn't want that to happen, as I explained earlier. In the context of the narrative, it's hard to escape the sense that Greece got lucky when Sparta proved to be a match for the Persians. If Athens had faced the Persians instead of the Spartans, the victory would have been all the more secure. But even though they don't end up fighting the Persians, the Athenians hardly fade into the background at this point. When Alexander of Macedon crosses over to the Greeks to warn them of the surprise attack that Mardonius has planned for the next morning, it is to Athens, as a steadfast guardian of freedom, that he addresses his warnings. During the confusion brought on by Amompharetus' refusal to retreat, the Athenians wait unmoved and unafraid by the Spartan side, quote, knowing all too well that Spartan attentions don't always match their words. And as a result, the Athenians are exposed to an attack by a valiant corps of Thebans who, in contrast with the unarmored and faint-hearted Persians, the Thebans fight so fiercely that 300 of their first and finest died at the hands of the Athenians. Herodotus even concludes his account of the action by drawing attention to Athens' famous skill at siegecraft as they helped the floundering Spartans overthrow the Persian fortifications. From the beginning of the action to its end, then, Athens is the only one that remains a steadfast and valiant champion of the Greek forces. The Plataea narrative's favorability toward Athens becomes even more remarkable when we consider that Herodotus is practically the only ancient source to praise the Athenians in any way for their role at Plataea. Even among Athenian sources as ideologically minded as funeral orations, the most favorable rendering of the Athenians at Plataea claims only that they, quote, stood in array of battle with the other Greeks, per Demosthenes, or that, per the Menexenus, in this exploit at least, the Lacedaemonians cooperated with the Athenians. Aeschylus, in his dramatic celebration of the Athenian victory at Salamis, attributes the victory at Plataea directly to the Dorian spear, without even mentioning Athenian participation. Herodotus then has chosen to portray the Athenians more favorably and the Spartans more negatively than any other surviving historian, poet, or orator who treats the events at Plataea. In the face of convincing scholarship by Charles Fornara, among others, that argues against the widespread presence of an Athenian bias in Herodotus, and considering work by a number of scholars, including Ray Nyland and Marco Batali, that argues against any disproportionate emphasis on Athenian sources in the Plataea narrative, Herodotus's unwavering and emphatic favorability toward Athens in the Plataea narrative suggests something different, a different possible explanation for his approach here. And I'm proposing that that is an original Athenian audience for whom Herodotus composed and performed the Plataea narrative. In other words, I think that the best explanation for this counterintuitive and almost propagandistic bias is that Herodotus's Plataea narrative was originally composed for a different audience than the rest of the histories. Essentially, that the narrative began as more of a local history. And the genre of local history was surely familiar to Herodotus. It is a well-established Herodotean convention to cite local sources for stories that are favorable to their polis, and Herodotus is so frequently doing that, in fact, that Detlev Fehling famously charged the historian with fabricating his source citations altogether. But whether Herodotus fabricated his sources or not, Herodotus plainly knew, or at least expected, that citizens would have a simple and straightforward preference for stories that were favorable to their polis. Thus, although Herodotus's narrative may at first seem almost hyperbolically pro-Athenian, the surviving funeral orations, which 927 resembles, and which may themselves be considered a type of local history, those funeral orations prove that such rhetoric was welcome and accepted in Athens. In fact, per Rosalind Thomas, Athenians would have been conditioned to expect a, quote, patriotic, nostalgic, and exceedingly simple portrayal of their city's legacy. However startling it may be to see a complex and sophisticated author such as Herodotus adopting such a straightforward approach, an audience that was familiar with and well-disposed toward the local traditions of Athens would have admired, appreciated, and even celebrated Herodotus's uncritical presentation of their city here. Whatever the generic distinctions between funeral oration and local historical tradition, Herodotus could safely assume that the Athenians, at least, would appreciate his favoritism. But, interestingly, it is not just Athens that receives a generous treatment from Herodotus. Two other states share Athens' place in the narrative as conspicuous proponents of Hellenic values and heroism, Phocis and Macedon. But wait, you may be thinking, didn't Phocis and Macedon both fight for the bad guys at Plataea? Why would Herodotus be interested in promoting the reputation of a couple Medeisers while undermining the generally acclaimed hero of Plataea, Pausanias, the Spartans? And although Herodotus makes excuses for Medeisers elsewhere in the histories, like Thermopylae, as we'll see, the Phocians and the Macedonians are the only Medeisers that he defends in the Plataea narrative. The Thessalians offer treacherous intelligence to Mardonius while urging him against Greece. The Argives most hastily send messengers to inform Mardonius of the Spartans' movements, and most dramatically, Herodotus consistently and emphatically denounces the Thebans, who warmly host the Persians at a banquet. They repeatedly advise the Persians on where and how best to attack the Greeks, and finally they face the Athenians in battle eagerly and resolvedly, even as the Persians themselves lose heart and retreat. In the Plataea narrative, it's not that Herodotus is out to excuse Medism, but that he's out to defend specifically Phocis and Macedon and no other nation against that charge. Now, for the sake of time, I need to pass over most of the textual evidence at this point, but I would like to mention at least two passages, specifically speeches given by Phocian and Macedonian leaders, that epitomize their portrayal in this narrative. The first, by the Phocian Harmocides, is given as the Phocians actually join the Persian army, because the Persians decide to attack the Phocians, presumably because they are loyal to the Greeks. As the Phocians prepare to fight, Harmocides delivers a stirring and patriotic oration, which concludes, "We must teach each one of the Persians what it means to be barbarians, and to conspire to the murder of men who are Greeks," explicitly situating the Phocians on the Greek side, even though they are in the act of joining the Persian army, while also making it clear that the Phocians have no sympathy for the Persian barbarians, for whom they will end up fighting. The second speech, delivered by the Macedonian monarch, Alexander I, to the Athenians to warn them of an impending Persian attack, similarly emphasizes Macedon's commitment to the Greek cause, its helplessness in the face of Persian strength, and its persistent loyalty to Hellenic ideals as an antithesis of the Persian who, like Harmocides, Alexander calls barbarians. Like Harmocides, Alexander concludes his speech with a stirring appeal to freedom and Hellenism, saying, "Please, if the war does end as you are trusting it will, you must bear me and my own freedom in mind as well. This risky venture which I have undertaken it for you. It is because I am such an enthusiast for the Greek cause that I wished to alert you to Mardonius's intentions and prevent the barbarians from sweeping down on you unawares. I am Alexander of Macedon." That's a stirring speech. Essentially, slide 17, Herodotus wants us to believe, or at least to get the impression, that where others did in fact betray Greece, both Phocis and Macedon were actually just doing their best to uphold Hellenic ideals while navigating a bad situation which was almost entirely out of their control. Herodotus's positive portrayal of Phocis and Macedon is even more surprising since, aside from Athens, every other Greek is portrayed negatively, even the ones who actually did fight for the Greeks. In fact, aside from the Spartans, who I've already discussed, most of the Greeks who fought against the Persians are so absent from the Plataea narrative that Plutarch accuses Herodotus of malice on their account, and those that are included do nothing but disobey orders, abandon their posts, and get slaughtered by the Persians because of their sloppy discipline and poor leadership. So why, then, does Herodotus single out these three Greek states, Athens, Phocis, and Macedon, for such positive treatment while leaving every other Greek state, including Thebes, Thessaly, Corinth, and even Sparta, with markedly unimpressive and sometimes even downright critical portrayals? This is a particularly astounding grouping because these three states, Athens, Phocis, and Macedon, share practically nothing in common. So let me show you what I mean. Phocis and Macedon were both Medeisers. Athens wasn't. Geographically speaking, Phocis and Athens were both mainland territories. Macedon is on the periphery of the Greek world. Ethnographically, Phocis is Doric. Macedon, which the genealogical myth at the beginning of the Plataea narrative actually makes clear, Macedon is Doric, but Athens is the Ionian state, so the explanation for their alignment can't be ethnographic. Where Macedon is a monarchy, with an emphasis on its aristocrats, Phocis was more of a regional confederacy with archons and such, and Athens was, of course, a democracy. As far as having a powerful contingent of aristocrats whose enmity Herodotus might have wished to avoid. Athens and Macedon certainly have their fair share of aristocrats, but references to Phocian aristocrats are few and far between, and besides, what of the significant power and influence that Thessaly and Thebes' aristocrats wielded? Then there's the possibility that Herodotus just likes these three states more than the others, but it at least he acknowledges their shortcomings elsewhere in the histories, and he defends and even praises most of the other Greeks who are marginalized and disparaged here. But what if Herodotus originally composed the Plataea narrative for an Athenian audience, as I have been arguing? Well, unfortunately, Athens, Phocis, and Macedon were unlikely to have been present simultaneously in one audience at the time of the history's traditionally accepted publication date, at least not without any of the states that are portrayed negatively in Herodotus's narrative. By the time that Herodotus was publishing the histories as we know them, the Peloponnesian War was either in full bloom, following the terminus post quem, or approaching the Sicilian expedition following Fanara, or possibly even in its final stages following Elizabeth Irwin's recent argument. Whichever publication date should be preferred, however, scholars have traditionally read the histories in the context of that war. And in fact, I am convinced by those scholars. I am not arguing against their conclusions at all. The histories as a whole should be analyzed in that historical context. But in the context of the Peloponnesian War, an audience that included not only Athens, but also Phocis and Macedon was highly unlikely because in the Peloponnesian War, both Phocis and Macedon were consistently allied with Sparta against Athens. In short, if the Plataean narrative were written at the same time as the rest of the histories, this alignment has no good explanation. But what if the effects of the histories pre-publication survive in the final text of the Plataea narrative? In other words, when might an audience of Athenians, Phocians, and Macedonians have existed? In fact, these three states were very closely aligned following the First Peloponnesian War in the mid-5th century, the precise period in which the biographical tradition suggests that Herodotus was performing in Athens. Phocis's strongest ally in the mid-5th century, an ancient friendship attested by Thucydides, was Athens, who fought the Second Sacred War to actually place Phocis in control of the Delphic oracle. Thucydides also calls the Macedonians, quote, an old friend and ally of the Athenians, and we have plenty of evidence that they remained so at least until the mid-5th century death of Alexander. There's every reason, then, to assume a large degree of diplomatic and social exchange between Athens, Phocis, and Macedon in the mid-5th century, and given Phocis's geographical proximity to Athens, its wealthiest citizens might easily have made frequent visits there, and even though Macedon's quite a bit further away, it was only a short trip by sea. However, however easy the journey, such exchanges between Phocis, Macedon, and Athens would have been much rarer in the more politically and much more politically fraught later in the 5th century when those states were at war. So I would argue then that Herodotus originally composed his Plataea narrative for an epidectic audience that included Athenians, Phocians, and Macedonians, and no other Greeks that are included in Herodotus's Plataea narrative, which could only plausibly have gathered in Athens in the mid-5th century BCE. In such a context of oral performance, the narrative would have become a living document that evolved in each telling. Rather than remaining fossilized in its original form, Herodotus would have performed his narrative, either in public or in private, and members of the audience would then have approached him afterward to relate their own relevant stories, whether from personal experience or from family tradition. Herodotus could then include any stories that he liked, or more to the point, any stories that he thought the audience might like, in his next performance. With Athens, Phocis, and Macedon's leading citizens represented in the audience, not only would Herodotus have been concerned to treat these nations favorably, He would also have heard related stories from these same individuals after the performance, which stories he might in turn include in his next performance. And those stories would have been full not only of pro-Athenian, pro-Phocian, and pro-Macedonian anecdotes, but also anti-Spartan, anti-Theban, and anti-Thessalian anecdotes, which could in turn explain the nature and magnitude of the negative portrayals in Herodotus's narrative. In short, I am proposing that those very stories contributed greatly to the first phase of Herodotus's composition of the Plataean narrative. So, to sum up, my argument so far has been that the Plataean narrative, as it survives in the histories, was originally composed with an audience of Athenians in mind way back in the mid-5th century as part of Herodotus's pre-publication career as an oral performer. With this conclusion, that Herodotus's histories contains epidectic influence in hand, then, let us turn to the other major battle narratives, Salamis and Thermopylae, which show similar evidence of an epidectic background. I'll begin with the Salamis narrative, which, just like the Plataea narrative, shows broad, sustained, and unilateral favoritism toward Athens. The main polis protagonist is Athens. The main individual protagonist, an element which Plataea mostly lacks, is an Athenian, one of Athens' most famous citizens, Themistocles. And the narrative again manifests Athenian ideology and interests. In fact, for over 90 chapters, Athens is practically the only Greek state that performs significant deeds or receives praise from Herodotus. The only other positive portrayals of Greek states are all of Athenian allies in the mid-5th century, some of them familiar from the Plataea narrative, like Phocis and Macedon, others appearing only in the Salamis narrative, like Plataea, Thespiae, and Aegina, and once more Athenian enemies and rivals from that period, like Sparta, Corinth, and Thessaly, receive negative or dismissive treatment. Of course, Athens' significant contribution to the naval battle at Salamis is actually a generally recognized historical fact, especially when compared to their role at Plataea, so it is a little more difficult to demonstrate conclusively that the Salamis narrative's favoritism toward Athens is as programmatic as it was in the Plataea narrative. But as pro-Athenian as the Plataea narrative was, the Salamis narrative is even more one-sided. Not only did the Athenians and Themistocles win basically every confrontation and battle by themselves, many of the Greek states who might easily have received praise are practically ignored. For example, it was Sparta, not Athens, that commanded the ships, but Eurybiades, the Spartan commander, is consistently marginalized and eventually even completely forgotten, unmentioned by Herodotus after 874.2, when the Greeks collectively marvel at his indecision. And in the same vein, Aegina, which provided a significant contingent for every naval encounter and ultimately received the prize for valor in the decisive battle from the Greeks, Aegina receives basically no recognition until the final 7 chapters, and even then their contributions are always explicitly paired with or secondary to Athens' own. In short, Athens' role in this narrative is much more amplified and persuasive than the events call for. Following the example set by Herodotus' Plataea narrative, then, I propose to detect the influence of a similar Athenian audience on the Salamis narrative. And indeed, through that lens, when we look at it, quite a few Athenian ideological interests of the mid-5th century feature prominently throughout the Salamis narrative. First of all 3 of the prominent 5th century Athenian mainstays that Matteo Barbato has identified in his recent book, that's Eugeneia, or Autochthony, Resistance to Hubris, and Diplomatic Philanthropia, all 3 of those are central and explicit in the Salamis narrative, even more than in the Plataea narrative. A lengthy excursus on the Athenians' Pelasgian heritage highlights their autochthonous status in terms that recall Demosthenes' funeral oration. The Athenians explicitly resist both the hubris of the Persians and of the Spartan Pausanias, which happened after the war. And several elements of the narrative actually evoke the Amazonnomachy, which is ideologically associated with resisting hubris. And the Athenians actually intervene in interstate disagreement no fewer than 6 times in the narrative, twice with the explicit ideologically charged label of stasis. Secondly, as you might expect for an audience of Athenians, Herodotus's treatment of naval and maritime subjects in the Salamis narrative is much more extensive and specialized than anywhere else in the histories. Not only does the narrative continuously advance the ideological nexus of ships, walls, and men that Carol Daugherty has identified as culturally important in mid-5th century Athens, it includes the only catalog of Greek ships in the histories and even an impressive amount of specialized naval terminology. So, for example, in the rest of the histories combined, only one maneuver, the Diakplus, is mentioned, but the Salamis narrative mentions not only the Diakplus, but four more naval tactics, including the embale, the hedgehog defense, and an encircling maneuver. Third, and sorry to kind of rush through all this, but I want to make sure that you get a chance to see all my conclusions here. The third thing is that the narrative also frequently showcases and celebrates rhetorical skill and its effective deployment with two of the longest and most rhetorically wrought speeches anywhere in the histories by Artemisia and by Themistocles, both of which use the rhetorical techniques of antithesis, oikos, and nomon to fortify their arguments. And indeed, Themistocles' use of persuasive speech is prominent throughout the Salamis narrative. He convinces Eurybiades and Adeimantus to remain at Artemisium. He sows dissension among the Ionians and Persians by his use of a clever written argument. Before the battle itself, Themistocles exhorted his troops better than anyone else on the grounds of logic and, again, antithesis. Themistocles also persuades Eurybiades to allow him to make the speech to the allied assembly. After the speech, he responds with ease to the threatening ridicule of Adeimantus, the Corinthian, and his arguments explicitly succeed, convincing Eurybiades and the other Greeks to stay and fight. Ultimately, his words keep the Greek commanders in their position at Salamis, leading to the victory of the otherwise reluctant Greeks and driving Xerxes back to Persia with most of his forces. Thus, rather than making the weaker argument stronger, as sophists were accused of doing later in the 5th century, Themistocles' rhetorical skill actually makes the better argument stronger. Themistocles is not resented for his rhetoric, like Socrates in Aristophanes' Clouds. Themistocles is a good sophist, the type of sophist that was celebrated in the mid-5th century Athens, Pericles period, before sophistry had earned its negative association. Finally, the narrative goes out of its way also to celebrate local Athenian religion, and especially Herodotus' concern with Demeter, specifically in her connection with the Eleusinian mysteries. So, for example, at 865, the exiled Demaratus observes a dust cloud hovering over Eleusis, such as 30,000 men might produce, and a loud roar which resembled the mystical Iakos cry. As Aristophanes and Plutarch both make clear, this portent would have been immediately recognizable to an Athenian audience as the sacred procession of Demeter and Persephone down the sacred way. Even the number of 30,000 probably signified the number of Athenians expected to participate in the procession. Still, Herodotus doesn't leave this portent's interpretation to the audience, but rather proceeds to make it quite explicit, because Demaratus, apparently, quote, ignorant of the Eleusinian rites, asks another exile, the Athenian Decius, to explain the meaning of this portent, to which Decius replies that clearly, since Attica is defenseless, the cry must be divine, coming from Eleusis to assist the Athenians and their allies. Not only does the portent evoke an important local rite, it further implies that the divine aid that Demeter brings to the Greeks on this occasion is directly attributable to the Athenians themselves. And actually, Nuno Simoes Rodrigues has recently argued that for Athens, not only was Demeter the perfect combination of an epicoric and pan-Hellenic deity, accepted across Greece as, quote, a protective goddess of the Hellenes, she was also a border keeper associated with Athenian autochthony. And he further argues that Athens promoted her mystery rituals specifically in connection with the growth of Athenian dominance in the mid-5th century, which they hoped would produce a pan-Hellenism built on an idea of ethnocentrism. Herodotus' narrative of Salamis specifically, quote, stresses the capital importance of Athens in this battle in a framework in which both goddesses of pan-Hellenic significance, Demeter and Persephone, would gain special relevance by operating in their primary Eleusinian sphere. Thus, the impact of an ideology of pan-Hellenism headed by Athens appears particularly strong in Herodotus' text, end quote. Demeter's inclusion in the Salamis narrative here represents a profound and emphatic evocation of Athens' divine Hellenic power. In sum, Herodotus's Salamis narrative is practically tailored to an Athenian audience in the mid-5th century and is even more programmatically and profoundly pro-Athenian than the Plataea narrative. Oops. All right. The third narrative, though, which Herodotus gives us, the Battle of Thermopylae, is quite a lot different from Salamis and Plataea. Athens doesn't figure so prominently in this battle narrative, and other states which received negative attention in the Plataea and Salamis narratives, including Sparta, Thessaly, and arguably even Thebes, are treated quite charitably in this narrative. And even though Sparta does come across as decidedly heroic, the narrative also seems to be resisting a Spartanocentric version, to borrow Pietro Fanicelli's phrase. Rather, the Thermopylae narrative appears to reflect the interests of a unique constellation of states, the Delphic Amphictyony, which presided over the seat of Demeter at Thermopylae, as well as the Delphic sanctuary. These nations shared very little in common, but in the context of the Persian Wars, one characteristic unites them. Almost all of them fought for the wrong side. The list of Medizers that Herodotus gives at 7132 lacks only the Delphians, Dorians, and Ionians, and the latter two of these, corresponding to larger ethnic groups, still included states that did Medize. If Herodotus wanted to please an Amphictyonic audience, then, he would have avoided awkward, incriminating anecdotes that questioned the act of Medism as self-interested or even traitorous, as so often occurs in the Salamis and Plataea narratives. No narrative related to the Persian War would have been more compelling or easier to spin favorably for this group than Thermopylae, which represented the combined Hellenic effort to resist the Persians at the very seat of the Amphictyony, and after that, almost all of the Amphictyonic members who hadn't yet Medized finally did go over to the Persians. To which end, as Emily Veriguanith has observed, the Thermopylae narrative attempts to explain Thessaly and the other Medizers' betrayal of Greece as by an appeal to necessity, ananke. But this approach directly contradicts Herodotus's portrayal of Medism in the Salamis and Plataea narratives. In the narratives which reflect an Athenian audience, states like Athens and Phocis that resisted Medism are celebrated for their willingness to stand up to the Persian threat, the terrible consequences that both states are willing to endure for the sake of Hellenic freedom are repeated and emphatically brought out as counterexamples to the Medizers' argument from necessity. Essentially, those narratives ask, what necessity could be greater than the loss of a city, the pillaging of temples, the massacre of citizens that both Athens and Phocis suffered? Yet the argument from necessity is the very argument that the Thermopylae narrative is most concerned to advance, especially as it pertains to members of the Delphic Amphictyony. I would argue that this reflects the influence of distinct audiences on Herodotus in the process of composing these narratives. And conveniently, an Amphictyonic audience would also have been gathered at one obvious venue, the Pythian festival. Several things support the supposition that Herodotus might have performed at such a venue. One, festivals are well-attested settings for the epidexis. Number two, Herodotus himself was said to have performed at such festivals. Three, attendees of a Pan-Hellenic festival would have been more sympathetic to Pan-Hellenic content, like the Persian Wars. Four, festivals would have offered practical exposure to, quote, the most eminent men in all of Greece, to use Lucian's phrase, as well as a certain prestige and financial reward that came from competing. And finally, Herodotus's histories are themselves an excellent testament to the importance of the Delphic sanctuary for his historiographical project, whether citing the Delphians in his narrative, praising them for bravery in the face of the Persian invasion, breaking with his usual policy of skepticism toward divine interference, or simply describing the sanctuary with the loving attention of an enthusiast. The histories show both familiarity with and affinity for the Delphic sanctuary. And once we identify Thermopylae as potentially having its roots in epideictic performance, we can actually compare the narrative with the other two epideictic performances And in fact, comparing Thermopylae with Salamis yields a particularly enlightening result. Not only does Salamis engage many of the same themes and arguments as the Thermopylae narrative, it also follows many of the same narrative patterns as well, so much so that the story arcs coincide on as many as 15 distinct points in almost exactly the same narrative order. In both narratives, the initial action between Greeks and Persians occurs at Artemisium, a small preliminary skirmish between Persians and Greeks, which is then followed by a decision to retreat. After the battle, in both narratives, a storm decimates the Persian fleet. Both narratives then include a more significant naval battle between Greeks and Persians, and with its conclusion, both narratives track a detailed advance of Xerxes and his forces, described almost as tourism in both cases. In the midst of both these Persian advances, Herodotus marks the religious impact of the advance by the inclusion of a local shrine, and following Xerxes' occupation of Greek territory, the Greek forces in both narratives are enumerated at length. At this point, the Salamis narrative actually reprises Xerxes' advance, where Thermopylae doesn't, through Attica this time, both in its topographical quasi-tourism and its inclusion of a religious sanctuary. I'd probably explain this divergent reprise when he reaches Athens as a function of the Salamis' narrative's Athenian audience. But after Xerxes attacks Athens and sacks Athens, everything returns to its parallel structure. In both narratives, the Peloponnesian proposal to fall back to the isthmus is overridden by Greeks whose territory would be lost by that action, Phocians and Locrians before Thermopylae, Athenians before Salamis. After the discussion, there is an episode featuring Demaratus in both narratives. Then a traitor is identified, although the traitor in the Salamis episode, Themistocles, is a false one. Thereafter, in quick succession, albeit in inverted order in the Salamis narrative, the Greek debate about whether to stay and fight is summarily ended by a message that the Persians have surrounded the Greeks. One man gives a decisive argument and resolves to stand his ground, Leonidas at Thermopylae, Themistocles at Salamis, and Herodotus cites an oracle that is then proven true by subsequent events. Finally, a decisive culminating battle is fought, remarkably circumscribed in both cases, after which battle Herodotus catalogues the death of Xerxes' brothers. Furthermore, the events of both battles are almost exclusively dominated by a similar narrative force, the actions of one central, essentially Homeric protagonist. And thus, we can observe that on as many as 15 different points, as well as their plot arc and protagonist momentum, the narratives of Thermopylae and Salamis, for almost their entire lengths, are remarkably parallel. By considering these passages not so much as sequential, but rather as two distinct but related performance texts, then, we can actually better understand their compositional patterns. So, in summary, the composition of the histories was complex. Even first-time readers noticed the disjunction and contradictions that practically define Herodotus' style. Scholars from Felix Jacobi to Nino Lauraghi have attempted to explain Herodotus' style in terms of methodology, but Arnaldo Moniano's famous proclamation remains true. The secrets of his workshop are not yet all out. Still, by attempting to apply the theory that Herodotus was deeply engaged in the epidectic wisdom performance culture of the mid-5th century to the major battle narratives, I hope to have shed some light on at least one more of these secrets. In order to truly understand the histories, we first have to understand their context. And by my reading, that context is neither monolithic nor straightforward, but rather a mismatched collage of times, places, and even modalities. The histories itself may have been complete, written, and unitary, but its epidictic roots help to shape and possibly even to affect significant portions of the final text. Thank you.